Today on thetruthaboutcars.com, we are out here in the mist taking a look at the 2016 Audi S7. Now, the S7, the A7, and the RS7 are kind of an interesting automotive twist. These are supposedly four-door coupes. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, this has too many doors in order to be a coupe or a coupe, then in my book, you're right. But in the modern use of this automotive vernacular, this is really just referring to the overall shape we have right back here, where we don't have much headroom in the rear, and we get this roof line that drops really drastically towards the rear end of the vehicle. Obviously, Mercedes has been fairly successful with the CLS AMG, so Audi thought, hey, why not try that with the A6 as well? And that's exactly what they did. They took an A6, they gave it this overall profile, slightly different back end, and then we got a lift back in the back instead of a traditional trunk. Now, this is not what BMW did with the 6 Series Grand Coupe, because they already had a 6 Series coupe. They already had that large luxury coupe going on, so they just took that and then they stretched it in order to create the Grand Coupe model. That means that while the vast majority of this interior is shared with the A6 and the vast majority of the CLS interior is shared with the E-Class, the largest part of the 6 Series interior is not shared with the 5 Series or the 7 Series. It actually is a little bit different than either one. Audi firmly believes in the one sausage, different length school of design, so we get a very similar front end to basically every other Audi product out there. Full LED headlamps in our particular model with this very distinctive daytime running lamp design inside, fog lamps down there, and because we're in the S7, we get a blacked out version of this sort of Billy the Big Mouth Bass grill. Base Audi A6 models in the US have to make do with a 4-cylinder engine and front-wheel drive, but when we make the transition to the A7, then we lose that base engine, we gain standard all-wheel drive and a standard 3-liter supercharged 6-cylinder engine. But we're here to talk about the S7, and this uses a 4-liter twin-turbo V8, producing a whopping 450 horsepower and 406 pound-feet of torque. All that power is mated through a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, not the standard 8-speed automatic that we find in the A7. Now, if that's not enough power, then the RS7 will take the same 4-liter basic engine design on up to 560 horsepower and 516 pound-feet of torque. And because of all that increased power and torque, that does move back to a traditional 8-speed automatic, and it loses the 7-speed DCT. We get the same sort of theme going on here in the tail lamp modules, very aggressive quad exhaust tips in the back, and then we get a pop-up spoiler on the back. Of course, the big change between this and the A6 is that we actually get a lift back instead of a traditional trunk. That means that you can actually fold down the rear seats and stick a barbecue in the back if you needed to, and it means this is also a little bit more practical than we find in the 6 Series Grand Coupe, which does have a very traditional trunk out back. The obvious downside to this form is the back seat, where we get an awful lot less headroom than we get in the A6. I do have to either crane my head to one side or lean forward or slouch back like this in order to keep my head from touching the ceiling. Now, legroom is not a problem. I do have about 2 inches of legroom left right here up front with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. And up front, it's basically the same as the A6. It's really just in the back here that we lose practicality. In addition to the more cramped dimensions back here, we also don't have a middle seat. The A7 and S7 share the majority of their interiors with the A6 and the S6, so we get the same general dashboard design, we get the same Audi MMI system that pops in and out of the dashboard, basically the same instrument cluster as well. Now, the S7 gives us this standard heads-up display, which I didn't find terribly attractive in the S6 or the A6. It's not the actual heads-up display itself, it's actually this module that's integrated into the dashboard right here. It looks a little bit more like an afterthought than I'd like. Of course, because the A7 is sporty, we get these integrated headrests right there and these sport seats with quilted leather. We get Alcantara inserts right over there on the door, sort of a reddish leather going on. We get carbon fiber trim right over here on the dashboard, and it has little red flakes in it to help pull out the red that we get in the rest of the interior. You can see the Audi MMI system right there that descends into the dashboard. We get the single slot optical displayer down there, 2-zone climate control as well. We of course have a Audi flat bottom steering wheel with S7 tagged right there at the bottom of the wheel. Buttons on either side for your audio system, the display right there in the dashboard. Then you'll find the radar adaptive cruise control on a stalk behind the steering wheel. It may seem like an unlikely place to test the Audi S7 out here on this incredibly rough, small winding road, because the S7 is not exactly a small car, but this car actually drives an awful lot smaller than you might think. I wouldn't necessarily call it nimble. It does still have a big, solid Germanic feel to it, but it is very well suited to these roads. The all-wheel drive system gives us an incredible amount of grip. The steering is relatively quick and accurate. It's not quite as quick as some of those options out there, but it's not quite as lazy as the Mercedes either. The acceleration in this model is incredibly fast. We ran from 0 to 60 in right around 4 seconds. It's like 3.95, which is a very, very low time. What's more surprising than that, however, is the 0 to 30 time, which is actually right around 1.5 seconds. And that is incredibly quick. Those times are actually sort of BMW M6 quick, even though this is actually one category down, because the RS7 is what actually competes with the M6. Braking times are also incredibly short in this vehicle, even though this is quite a heavy car. And you can thank those ultra-wide 275 with tires up front for that. 275 with tires are very, very wide for front tires in a sedan. You may find sport utility vehicles in the performance category with tires this wide, but actual sedans, it's pretty darn rare. Those ultra-wide tires help compensate for the fact that this has about 60% of its weight up front. Handling is absolutely excellent in the S7, and I would say this truly is the equal of the CLS 550 and the BMW 650i Gran Coupe. Perhaps the best thing about the S7 is the way this vehicle rides, because it does get a standard air suspension. Now, a lot of people dislike the way air suspensions behave, so if you don't like a little bit of extra float, a little bit of extra disconnect, and you're not willing to trade that for an improved ride, then you're probably not going to like the S7. You're going to want one of the other options that uses a traditional steel spring setup. However, I prefer a slightly softer ride in my performance car. I'm willing to give up that little bit of edge for an awful lot of daily commuting excellence, and that's definitely what we're getting in this Audi. This is much easier to live with on a daily basis than the other entries in the segment because the suspension is a little bit more compliant. Also quite interesting is that this suspension actually allows us to raise the vehicle up in addition to changing the softness of the suspension. All-wheel drive used to be something a bit more unique to Audi. Basically everybody in this segment is now doing it, but it really improves grip in inclement weather. We're on this wet, winding mountain road right here. There's dirt, there are leaves on it, etc. This feels very, very sure-footed. Now again, BMW and Mercedes are of course putting all-wheel drive on their models these days, but it is optional. Now on the downside, that means that this vehicle does not have that same kind of rear-wheel drive dynamic that we get out of the CLS or the 6 Series Gran Coupe if you were to choose rear-wheel drive. The S7 slots between the CLS 550 4MATIC and the 650i xDrive in a variety of different ways. This starts at $82,900. The BMW is a little bit more expensive at $94,895, and the Mercedes is actually a little bit less expensive at $76,600. I like the interior of this a little bit more than the Mercedes interior, but not quite as much as the BMW interior. When it comes to driving dynamics, the weight balance we get in this vehicle does affect the handling, but primarily on the feel side, not really on the handling performance side. When you're putting this car into a corner at relative high speeds, you will feel the front end resist turning a little bit more than the rest of the competition, and we get a little bit less feel out of the front of this than we get in the rest of the competition. However, Audi compensates more than you might think with these extremely wide tires up front. And when it comes to actual grip, I didn't really find that much difference between the two. The big difference for me is that I found that it was easier to tell what the front end of the Mercedes or the BMW were doing versus this Audi. But in terms of actual capability, they're really quite close. Now, if you do prefer a rear-wheel drive feel, then obviously there is no competition for the Mercedes or the BMW on the Audi side, because this only comes as an all-wheel drive sedan. Now that said, I would actually take the all-wheel drive version of all three of these before I took the rear-wheel drive version of any of them. And the reason for that is I don't spend my day on a track. I do like the way cars feel out on tracks, and I will not argue that the 6 Series or the CLS feels better in rear-wheel drive form on a track than the S7. But as I said, I don't live on a track. I live on gravel roads like this, I drive on rainy roads, I drive in the mountains, etc. And I like the sure-footed feeling that you get in all-wheel drive. And I also like to be able to apply all 450 horsepower whenever I want to. And you just can't do that in a rear-wheel drive vehicle with this much power. The moment it starts raining a little bit, the rear wheels are going to slip, you're not going to be able to apply all that power. All-wheel drive cars like this can actually apply all that power even in slight inclement weather. In selecting between these three entries in this segment, of high importance to me is interior design. And I think this interior does look about $6,000 better than we find over there in the CLS 550. And although I like the 6 Series interior better than this, I don't think it looks $12,000 better than we find over here. The infotainment system in the Audi and the BMW is also notably ahead of the command system that we find in the current generation CLS 550. And although I like that Mercedes traditional automatic transmission, this probably has one of the best dual clutch transmissions I have ever driven, and overall, I would take this over the CLS 550. Now, if money was no object, I would take the 650i xDrive Gran Coupe over this model. However, Money is an object for me, and $12,000 is a decent amount more to spend for the BMW over the Audi, even though I do think it looks a little bit more attractive on the outside, looks a little bit more attractive on the inside, and I prefer its general driving dynamics. It's just not that much better over the S7. And so the S7 is actually my top pick in this particular segment, and the BMW comes in at number 2. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes with thetruthaboutcars.com. Check out the full written review on this over there at ttac.com, and I'll see you next week.